Okay. Now if you look at on page 17, the two sets of cause and effect. Now in this Four Noble Truths, we will see two sets. The first set is the suffering and the origin of suffering, and the second set is the cessation and path which leads to that cessation. So in the Four Noble Truths, we will see these two sets of the cause and effect. Now, what we need to know in looking at the two sets, we need to understand, looking at the first set, the suffering and the origin of suffering. While we are studying those two noble truths, we need to understand: is there any relation that sets to our own present life? Is there any relation? Is there any connection? Or are this first set, the suffering and the origin of suffering, is happening in here or not? That is something very important to look at. What the Buddha and the subsequently Buddhist teacher have said, the first set, the suffering and the origin of suffering, is happening to the unenlightened being. That set is happening, processing, in the unenlightened being. And the second set, the cessation and the path which leads to cessation, that second set is happening, or the taking place to those enlightened beings. So whether we are enlightened being or unenlightened being, we need to look at which set is operating within us. If the first set is operating within us, then we are unenlightened being. Therefore, we are experiencing pain, difficulty, sorrow, lamentation, so on and so forth, and the origin of those also happening within us. If the cessation and path which leads to cessation, if these two are operating within us, happening within us, or have within us, then we are enlightened being. We will not have sorrow, lamentation, pain, so on and so forth. So that is something quite useful to look at. And this set, although in the present the sutra which we have looked at very briefly, it is quite short version, but more detail how the two sets, the first set is operating within the unenlightened being, the second set is operating within the enlightened being. The more detail is explained, as I said earlier, the Buddhist teachings of the 12 links of dependent origination, which also we are going to look at that little bit detail in the when we look at the what's called the second noble truth of origin of suffering. When we look at that particular noble truth, we will look at a little bit closer the 12 links of dependent origination. But here, to bear in your mind, that is something quite useful to look at. Now then, briefly, on page 22, on page 22, which says, being our own refuge. Then I'll stop to have some questions. Now here, it is very useful to think. As I quoted one quotation here, and also there are similar quotation in the Dhammapada. It says, "One is one's own refuge. Who else would be the refuge?" Like that, that kind of quotation. And the Buddha, said in many other occasions similar to this, saying, one is one's own refuge. Who else would be the refuge? Buddha strongly encouraged to his followers, his disciples, particularly if you read those sutras in the Theravadan tradition, in Pali version of the sutras. Buddha strongly encouraged to the people, to his disciples, not relying on him, not depend on him. He strongly encouraged, to be independent, to become oneself is one's own refuge. Not take the refuge to the others. And that is something very, very important for us. In this, while we are studying the Four Noble Truths, particularly while we are studying the last two Noble Truths, the cessation and the path which leads to cessation, while we are studying those two Noble Truths, what we will learn, we will learn to cultivate refuge within ourselves. Refuge within ourselves, not something externally. Yes, we can say, the Buddha, as a historical Buddha, as the first refuge. It is first refuge in the sense of he discovered the path to leads to the cessation, and he showed us the path which leads to the cessation. That's only he has done in terms of he being our refuge. Our main and actual refuge is when these two, the cessation and the path which leads to cessation, when these two are cultivated within ourselves, that is the true refuge. And that is really important for us to bear in our mind, and try to understand while we are studying the Four Noble Truths. Try to understand, the Buddhist, the practice which we call the core practice, the taking refuge in three jewels. What is the main refuge? What is the actual refuge? Is there externally somewhere there, somebody as my refuge, or actual refuge, the main refuge is within me, here, not outside there. If it is within me, within here, then what is it? And that is really important part in here we need to know. In many occasions, the Buddha said, we all have potential. We all have potentiality to become a Buddha. That means we all, become our own refuge. If we become Buddha, that is refuge, isn't it? So that is really something quite important to bear in our mind. Okay, so now if you have some questions, we'll have some questions and answers. As you can see now how I'm doing, I'm not going to read each paragraph or each chapter. What I'll do, I'll pick up the important parts which I want to explain and which I want to edit on a little bit, what I haven't said in here, and really I would encourage you to read and then when these two come together, then your sort of understanding, I hope, will grow. So not completely rely on only what I've said here, and also not only rely on this book, to really bring the many things together, then the understanding will grow. Okay. Question? Anyone has any questions? Oh, there's one. First here. Okay.
I was wondering why in the first noble truth it is said to be understood and the third one is then to be realized. What's the difference between understanding and realizing?
Okay. Realizing can be just experiencing. The understanding is not necessarily experiencing it. For example, if you understand the dukkha, the suffering, it's not necessarily you are experiencing suffering. Realizing, experiencing, that is really more you are experiencing it. When you say the cessation, truth of cessation of suffering and origin of suffering to be realized, that means you are experiencing it. Also you are understanding, but also you are experiencing it. But in the first noble truth, for example, Buddha fully understands the suffering, but he is not experiencing the suffering. So that's different.
The experience of suffering, experiencing it, is also some kind of thing that we need, in order to realize and that there is suffering.
Take an example: a cook who knows every single ingredient to make that delicious cake, and also how to bake, what the temperature and everything. So he or she understands how to make that delicious cake, but not necessarily he or she experience that delicious, isn't it? So that sort of example is there. Yeah, that's why saying fully understood, not saying realize. I mean, you can use that, he realizes other people's suffering and like that, but here the understanding has some, that's the purpose. Anyway, here, can you pass down the microphone?
Is it okay to ask a question about something?
Yes.
On page 18 is the last feeding sutra.
Page 18. Yes.
In the first two lines.
Yes.
The question I have is regarding the first line. Okay. The second line seems like easier if you have something that's impermanent, then it's in a state of constant change, and so it can then engage with other phenomena, and they can produce cause and effects on each other. But in the first one, if something is permanent, how can it relate to anything else at all? How can it give rise to anything else? So what I don't understand is that due to the existence of this, that arises. What is the difference between that and the next line?
Yes. And this Rice Seedling Sutra, this quotation, sometimes these three lines are explained, the dependent origination, dependent arising, in three different levels of dependent understanding of dependent origination. So the dependent origination, if it is dependently originated, it not necessarily be impermanence. In a very, very subtle level, subtle levels of dependent origination. So, say for example, the whole and the parts. These two are not cause and effect, because these two are, coexist. If it is cause and effect, they cannot coexist. The cause come first, result come later. But the whole and the parts, they are, these two are dependently originated. They are dependently arising nature, but they are not cause and effect, because they are, the exist, coexist, you say? Yeah, exist simultaneously. That is the second levels of dependent origination. And the third levels of dependent origination in a more subtle level, which this will come in the fifth module when you talk about emptiness. This, the dependent origination in the subtle level. So in the dependent origination in the subtle level, it's really, not necessarily something produce something makes something. It is, because this happened, that happened. Not necessarily this will produce this one. Not necessarily this will, come into being from this one. But simply because this happened, that occur. For example, to say, when you talk about over there, because over here, if over here is not there, here it not exist, you can't talk about over there, isn't it? But over there doesn't arise from over here. It's simply just, there are many things like that. It's sort of simply because of this happened that occur. But what is occur not necessarily arise from here. Understand? So that's here what this first line is talking about. Due to existence of this, that arises. Okay, there's mic. Can you use the mic? Yeah.
So you're really talking about duality in that last.
Duality in what sense you're talking?
Well, because you're defining something, then it implies this.
Oh yes, you can. In that sense, you can talk about duality. Yeah, yeah.